Jake Harrison wiped sweat from his forehead as he worked on the engine bay of the cargo ship Aurora's Dream. The 28-year-old engineer had been fixing ships since he was 16, and this routine maintenance job should have been easy. He tightened the last bolt on the plasma conduit and stepped back to admire his work. The engine hummed with perfect efficiency now. "Good work, Jake," called Captain Martinez from the doorway. "We need to make one more supply run to Asteroid Station Delta 7 before heading home. The miners there are running low on oxygen recyclers." Jake nodded and gathered his tools. He enjoyed these supply runs to the Outer Rim territories. The asteroid belt was dangerous but peaceful compared to the crowded inner worlds. Pirates occasionally caused trouble, but most ships traveled safely through the mining zones. 2 hours later, the Aurora's Dream dropped out of hyperspace near Delta 7. Jake was checking the cargo manifest when alarms started blaring throughout. The ship red lights flashed, and the captain's voice echoed over the intercom. "All hands to emergency stations. We have unknown ships approaching fast." Jake rushed to the bridge where Captain Martinez and pilot Amy Collins were staring at the scanner displays. 3 large ships were closing in on them with weapons powered. The ships looked unlike anything Jake had seen before, with curved hulls and strange energy signatures. "They're not responding to our hails," Amy reported. Her hands flew over the controls as she tried to plot an escape course. "Those ships are too fast. We can't outrun them." The lead ship fired a blue energy beam that struck Aurora's Dream. All the lights went out for a moment before emergency power kicked in. Jake felt the deck plates vibrate as unknown forces grabbed hold of their ship. "Tractor beam, Captain Martinez," said grimly. "Prepare to be boarded." Jake had heard stories about slave raiders, but never thought he would encounter them. The Zephyrian Empire was supposed to operate far from human space. These reptilian aliens were known throughout the galaxy for capturing other species and selling them as workers. Heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor outside the bridge. The door exploded inward, and tall lizard-like creatures stormed in, wearing dark armor. Their scales were green and black, and their yellow eyes showed no mercy. The largest one pointed a weapon at Captain Martinez. "Surrender or die," the alien said in broken but understandable English. "Your species will serve the Empire." Captain Martinez raised his hands slowly. Jake and Amy did the same. There was no point in fighting against armed raiders when they were outnumbered and trapped. Zephyrian leader stepped forward. Jake noticed the rank markings on his armor identified him as some kind of commander. "I am Commander Vexter of the 3rd Raiding Fleet. You are now property of the Empire." Jake watched in horror as the raiders rounded up the crew. Engineer Pete Murphy tried to run and was stunned by an energy weapon. Cook Linda Torres was roughly grabbed and her hands bound with metal restraints. The Zephyrians seemed to know exactly what they were doing. "Please," Captain Martinez pleaded. "We're just cargo haulers. We have families back home." Commander Vexter laughed coldly. "Your families do not concern me. The Empire needs workers, and your species appears suitable for manual labor." Jake's mind raced as he was forced into restraints. He had studied alien technology and knew that Zephyrian ships used outdated shield generators. If he could find the right components, he might be able to build a distress beacon that could pierce their jamming fields. While the raiders searched the ship for valuables, Jake slowly moved toward a maintenance panel. His engineering training had taught him to always look for backup options in any system. The Aurora's Dream had emergency transmitters hidden throughout the hull. Jake managed to slip a small tool from his belt and began working on the panel. If he could route power through the secondary communications array, he might be able to send a signal to the nearest patrol ship. His fingers worked quickly to connect the right circuits. A heavy hand grabbed his shoulder and spun him around. Commander Vexter stood behind him, holding a scanner that showed exactly what Jake had been doing. The alien's yellow eyes narrowed with anger. "Clever little human," Vexter hissed. "You will learn that resistance is futile." The commander struck Jake with the back of his clawed hand. Pain exploded across Jake's face, and he tasted blood, too. Guards dragged him toward the airlock where other crew members waited. "Mark this one as troublesome," Vexter ordered. "He has technical skills that might prove useful, but he cannot be trusted." As Jake was pushed into the Zephyrian transport ship, he caught sight of a young female Zephyrian watching from the shadows. Unlike the others, she seemed uncomfortable with what was happening. Her scales were lighter colored, and her eyes held something that might have been sympathy. The transport ship was filled with beings from many different worlds. Jake saw tall, blue-skinned Andromedians with 4 arms, massive furry creatures that might have been Centaurians, and dozens of species he didn't recognize. All of them wore the same metal restraints and expressions of defeat. The ship's engines roared to life and Jake felt them accelerating toward hyperspace. Through a small porthole he watched the Aurora's dream shrink into the distance. His home was gone and his future looked very dark indeed. But Jake Harrison was not the type of person to give up easily. Somewhere in the galaxy there had to be a way to escape and return home. He just had to survive long enough to find it. The transport ship emerged from hyperspace near the largest space station Jake had ever seen. Kepler Station stretched 4 kilometers in every direction with docking bays, living quarters, and industrial sections connected by massive support beams. Hundreds of ships moved around the station like insects around a hive. Jake pressed against the porthole to get a better view. This was clearly the center of the Zephyrian slave trade operation. Ships arrived constantly bringing new prisoners, while others departed with cargo holds full of workers bound for distant worlds. "Welcome to your new home," sneered a guard as prisoners were herded toward the docking tube. "Work hard and you might live long enough to see another year." The processing center was a nightmare of bureaucracy and brutality. Prisoners were sorted by species and physical capabilities, while Zephyrian overseers decided their assignments. Jake watched as families were separated and sent to different sections of the station. A 4-armed Andromedian was assigned to be Jake's supervisor. The alien introduced himself as Thrak and explained the basic rules of survival. Work assignments were given each morning, food rations were distributed twice daily, and any form of resistance was punished severely. "The key is to become invisible," Thrak advised as they walked through the lower maintenance levels. "Do your job well enough to avoid punishment, but not so well that you attract attention. Most guards will ignore you if you give them no reason to notice you." Jake was assigned to repair work in the deepest sections of the station. The Zephyrians had built Kepler Station, using technology from dozens of conquered civilizations, but they didn't understand how all the systems worked together. Critical components failed regularly, and prisoners were sent to fix problems that the guards couldn't solve. On his 3rd day, Jake discovered something interesting. The station's power distribution network had serious design flaws that could cause cascading failures if the right components were damaged. The Zephyrians had built their facility like a house of cards without realizing how unstable it really was. Jake began making mental notes of every weakness he found. Backup power systems that couldn't handle full loads, ventilation controls that could be reversed, security networks that relied on single points of failure. If someone knew what they were doing, they could cause serious problems for the station's operations. "You're different from the others," Thrak observed during their lunch break. "Most prisoners stop thinking about escape after the first week." "You're still planning something," Jake shrugged, and continued eating his ration of processed protein. "I'm an engineer. I can't help looking at how things work." That afternoon Jake met Dr. Alina Rodriguez in the medical bay. The xenobiologist had been captured 3 months earlier during a research expedition and assigned to help treat injured prisoners. Unlike most slaves who had given up hope, Alina still burned with anger at her situation. "They destroyed 5 years of research when they took me," Alina said as she bandaged a cut on Jake's hand. "I was studying symbiotic relationships between different species. The data could have helped dozens of worlds develop better agricultural systems." Jake studied Alina's face and saw the same determination that drove him to keep fighting. "Maybe we can help each other. I know engineering and you know biology. Together we might find opportunities that neither of us could manage alone." Alina glanced around to make sure no guards were listening. "What did you have in mind?" "I've been mapping the station's weaknesses," Jake whispered. "There are ways to cause major system failures, but it would take coordination and timing. We'd need help from other prisoners." Over the following weeks, Jake and Alina carefully recruited other slaves who still had fight left in them. They found Korthok, a massive Centaurian warrior whose clan had been enslaved after their homeworld was conquered. Despite his intimidating size, Korthok was gentle and intelligent. "My people believed that freedom was worth any sacrifice," Korthok rumbled in his deep voice. "I have been waiting for someone with a plan." The breakthrough came when Jake prevented a reactor coolant leak that would have killed thousands of people. He was working on a routine repair when he noticed radiation levels climbing beyond safe limits. Instead of reporting the problem through official channels, Jake fixed it himself using spare parts and improvised solutions. Word of Jake's heroic act spread quickly through the prisoner population. For the first time since capture, many slaves began to believe that resistance might be possible. The Zephyrians, however, were not pleased with Jake's initiative. "You were assigned to repair lighting systems," snarled Overseer Craigtall. "Reactor maintenance is not your responsibility." Jake stood straight despite the Overseer's threatening posture. The leak would have killed everyone in sections 12 through 15. I couldn't just ignore it. Craigtor struck Jake across the face with his clawed hand. You will learn to follow orders exactly as given. Any further interference with station operations will result in severe punishment, but the damage was already done. Jake's actions had inspired hope throughout the slave quarters and proven that humans were more capable than the Zephyrians realized. Alina used her medical access to spread messages between different prisoner groups, while Korthok recruited warriors from various species. The resistance network grew slowly and carefully. Each member was vetted through multiple contacts and given specific roles based on their skills and position. Technical specialists studied station blueprints, medical staff gathered intelligence on guard rotations, and strong workers prepared for the physical challenges of an uprising. Jake found himself becoming a symbol of defiance without meaning to. Other prisoners looked to him for leadership even though he had never asked for that responsibility. The weight of their hopes was almost as heavy as his restraints. "They're planning something special for you," Alina warned during one of their secret meetings. I overheard guards talking about teaching the troublesome human a lesson. Jake had expected this. Commander Vextar couldn't allow his authority to be challenged without responding. The question was what form that response would take. The answer came the next morning when Jake was dragged from his work assignment by armed guards. Instead of punishment detail or solitary confinement, he was taken to a section of the station he had never seen before. The arena was a massive circular chamber with tiered seating for thousands of spectators. Zephyrian citizens and wealthy aliens came to Kepler Station for entertainment and gambling. Gladiatorial combat was apparently one of the station's primary attractions. Commander Vextar waited in the center of the arena wearing ceremonial armor. His yellow eyes glowed with anticipation as guards forced Jake to kneel before him. "Citizens of the Empire," Vextar announced to the gathering crowd. "Today you will witness what happens to slaves who forget their place." This human thought he could challenge our authority. Let him try to survive against a true warrior. The arena gates opened and Goroth emerged wearing full combat armor that gleamed under the bright lights. The Zephyrian warrior stood nearly 3 meters tall and carried weapons that could cut through steel. His scaled face showed no emotion. As he studied his human opponent, Jake wore simple prisoner clothing and had no weapons or armor. The crowd cheered for what they expected to be a quick execution. Betting screens around the arena showed odds of 1,000 to 1 against the human surviving more than 2 minutes. "This is what happens to those who resist the Empire, Commander," Vextar announced. "Let the lesson begin." Jake circled the arena looking for anything he could use as a weapon or advantage. The floor was made of polished metal with drainage grates, spaced at regular intervals. Support pillars rose to the ceiling and spectator balconies provided multiple levels of viewing. Goroth charged forward with his energy blade raised. Jake rolled to the side just as the weapon struck the floor where he had been standing. Sparks flew as the blade cut deep into the metal surface. The warrior was strong, but his heavy armor made him slower than Jake. The crowd laughed as Jake ran around the arena, avoiding Goroth's attacks. They thought the human was simply delaying the inevitable, but Jake was studying his opponent and learning how the armor worked. Every system had weaknesses if you knew where to look. Jake noticed that Goroth's helmet had ventilation slits near the base. The armor's power pack was mounted on the warrior's back and connected to various systems through exposed cables. Most importantly, the leg joints had limited flexibility that affected the warrior's balance. When Goroth swung his blade in a wide arc, Jake grabbed one of the exposed cables and pulled hard. Warning lights flashed on the armor as power flow was disrupted. The warrior stumbled, and Jake used the opportunity to climb onto his back. The crowd's laughter turned to confused murmurs as the human began systematically attacking weak points in the armor. Jake pulled more cables loose and jammed his fingers into ventilation ports. Goroth spun and thrashed, trying to dislodge his small opponent. Jake found the helmet release mechanism and triggered it. Goroth's head protection fell away, revealing his scaled face and yellow eyes. The warrior roared in anger and slammed backward against a support pillar, trying to crush Jake. Pain shot through Jake's ribs, but he held on and continued his assault on the armor systems. He found the power pack's emergency release and pulled the manual override. The entire suit began shutting down as backup power took over. Goroth's movements became sluggish as his armor lost full power. Jake dropped to the ground and picked up a piece of debris from the damaged floor. The metal fragment was sharp and heavy enough to serve as a crude weapon. The warrior tried to grab Jake, but his movements were too slow now. Jake dodged the clumsy attack and struck at the exposed joints where armor plates met. Sparks flew as he damaged control circuits and sensory systems. The crowd had gone completely silent. What they were watching was impossible, according to everything they knew about humans. This primitive species was supposed to be weak and stupid, yet somehow this individual was defeating a professional warrior. Goroth abandoned his weapons and tried to tackle Jake with his bare hands. But without his armor's enhanced strength, he was just a large reptile fighting a desperate human who refused to give up. Jake used his smaller size and greater agility to stay out of reach while continuing to attack vulnerable spots. The end came. When Jake managed to damage the armor's life support system, Goroth collapsed as his breathing apparatus failed and backup air ran out. The mighty warrior lay motionless on the arena floor while Jake stood over him breathing heavily. Commander Vexter stared in shock at what had just happened. The crowd erupted in chaos as beings throughout the arena tried to understand how a human slave had defeated their champion. Betting systems crashed as impossible odds became reality. Jake raised his hands in victory and looked up at the spectator sections. In the slave viewing area he could see Alina and Korthok cheering along with hundreds of other prisoners. For the first time since their capture they had something to celebrate. Impossible, Vextar whispered. Then louder he announced the human is victorious. Let this be a lesson to all who doubt the fighting spirit that makes good entertainment. But Jake knew this was about more than entertainment. His victory had shattered the Zephyrian belief that humans were weak and helpless. Every slave in the arena had seen that their captors could be defeated. The psychological impact was enormous. Over the following days, word of Jake's arena triumph spread throughout Kepler Station. Prisoners who had given up hope began to whisper about resistance again. Guards found themselves being watched more carefully by slaves, who no longer seemed completely broken. Commander Vextar decided to capitalize on Jake's unexpected popularity by scheduling more fights. The arena brought in wealthy spectators from across the sector and gambling revenues were enormous. If the human could continue winning, then Vextar would profit greatly from his unusual gladiator. Jake was moved to better quarters and given improved food rations. He was also allowed to train with actual weapons instead of improvised tools. The Zephyrians wanted their new starfighter to be healthy and capable of putting on good shows, but Jake used his training time for more than combat preparation. Elena and Korthok visited him regularly under the pretense of medical checkups and strategy discussions. They were actually coordinating resistance activities throughout the station. The guards are getting nervous, Elena reported during one visit. They've started doing random searches of prisoner quarters and increasing patrol schedules. Korthak nodded grimly. My contacts in the heavy labor sections report that overseers are asking questions about prisoner attitudes. They suspect something, but don't know what. Jake studied the arena layout drawings that Elena had smuggled from the medical files. We need to move faster than planned. If they discover the network before we're ready, then everyone will be executed. The resistance had grown beyond anything Jake had imagined possible. Representatives from over 30 different species were now part of the organization. Each group brought unique skills and knowledge that strengthened the overall effort. Specialists had identified critical vulnerabilities in the station's infrastructure. Medical staff had prepared supplies for treating wounded during the uprising. Warriors from various worlds had begun training together despite ancient racial conflicts. Your next fight is scheduled for tomorrow, Alina informed Jake. Commander Vexter is bringing in a champion from the Rigel system. They say he's never been defeated. Jake smiled grimly. Then it's time to send a message that will be heard across the galaxy. Win or lose, we're going to show them that humans don't make good slaves. The following morning, Jake was escorted to the arena by a full squad of guards. Word of the fight had spread, and the spectator sections were packed with beings from across the sector. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. But in the slave viewing areas, Alina and Korthok were making final preparations for something much more important than gladiatorial combat. The uprising would begin during Jake's fight when security attention was focused on the arena. After months of careful planning, the moment of truth had finally arrived. Far beyond Kepler Station, Captain Lisa Chen received the emergency transmission that would change everything. The message was weak and fragmented, but it contained information about human prisoners being held by Zephyrian slavers, Lisa commanded. The Terran Confederation cruiser defender, and had been hunting slave traders for 2 years. Ma'am, we're picking up more chatter about this human gladiator, reported Communications Officer Dan Walsh. Multiple sources confirm there's someone fighting in the arena who's become quite famous. Lisa studied the intelligence reports on her screen. The idea that a human had survived long enough to become a gladiator was remarkable. Most species captured by Zephyrians were broken quickly and sent to labor camps. Someone was not only surviving, but thriving in captivity. Plot a course for the Kepler system, Lisa ordered. Maximum stealth approach. If there are humans being held there, we need to know exactly what we're dealing with. Meanwhile, in the arena, Jake faced his newest opponent. The champion from Rigel was a massive insectoid creature with razor-sharp claws and natural armor plating. The crowd cheered as the two fighters circled each other looking for advantages. But Jake's mind was only partially focused on the combat. He knew that Alina and Korthok were preparing to trigger the uprising. Every move he made in the arena was part of a carefully coordinated plan to free thousands of prisoners. The insectoid charged forward with clicking mandibles aimed at Jake's throat. Jake rolled under the attack and grabbed a weapon from the arena's equipment rack. The sword felt familiar in his hands after weeks of training. In the lower levels of the station, Alina moved through the medical bay gathering supplies that would be needed during the rebellion. She had spent months mapping the station's security systems and knew exactly when guard shifts changed. The timing had to be perfect. Korthok assembled his team of warriors from a dozen different worlds. Despite their species' historical conflicts, they had learned to work together under his leadership. The massive Centaurian had become a symbol of unity among the enslaved populations. Jake's sword clashed against his opponent's natural weapons as they battled across the arena floor. The insectoid was strong, but Jake had learned to use speed and intelligence instead of relying on brute force. Every victory had taught him new lessons about combat and survival. Commander Vexter watched from his private box as profits poured in from gambling on the fight. He had no idea that his prize gladiator was coordinating a massive rebellion even while fighting for his life. The Zephyrian commander thought he had everything under control. Alina triggered the first phase of the uprising. By releasing a carefully prepared virus into the station's computer network, the program would gradually disable security systems without causing immediate alarms. Technical specialists throughout the station received her signal and began their own sabotage efforts. Jake noticed the subtle changes in the arena's lighting and environmental controls. The rebellion had begun and there was no turning back now. He pressed his attack against the insectoid champion with renewed determination. The alien warrior's claws raked across Jake's arm, drawing blood, but he ignored the pain and continued fighting. In the spectator sections, prisoners began moving toward predetermined positions. The carefully planned uprising was unfolding exactly as rehearsed. Korthak's warriors struck first against the guard barracks in the lower levels. Years of suppressed rage exploded into violence as enslaved beings fought back against their captors. The Zephyrians were caught completely off guard by the coordinated assault. Jake drove his sword through a gap in his opponent's armor and the insectoid collapsed with a final clicking sound. The crowd erupted in cheers, but Jake immediately looked toward the slave viewing sections. Alina gave him a subtle hand signal that confirmed the uprising was proceeding on schedule. Emergency alarms began sounding throughout the station as Zephyrian commanders realized they were under attack. Commander Vexter's victory celebration turned to horror as reports flooded in about fighting in multiple sections. Impossible, Vexter snarled as he studied the tactical displays. How could slaves organize something like this? They're supposed to be broken and hopeless. Jake climbed toward the spectator areas as arena security tried to maintain order. The carefully planned rebellion was becoming a chaotic battle as prisoners overwhelmed their guards through sheer numbers and desperate courage. Alina led medical teams through the station treating wounded rebels and coordinating supply distribution. Her knowledge of the facility's layout proved invaluable as fighters moved to secure critical objectives. Korthak's forces captured the main armory and began distributing weapons to other prisoner groups. The massive Centaurian fought with the fury of someone who had endured years of slavery. His warrior skills were legendary among his people, and the Zephyrians learned why. Captain Lisa Chen's ship dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler system just as the rebellion reached its peak. Long-range sensors detected weapon discharges and communication traffic indicating a major battle was taking place. "Ma'am, we're reading massive energy spikes from the station," reported Sensor Officer Frank Gomez. "Multiple explosions and what looks like ship movement in all directions." Lisa studied the tactical display with growing amazement. "It looks like a full-scale revolt. How is that possible?" Jake reached the command center where Alina and Korthok were coordinating the final phases of the rebellion. Thousands of prisoners had been freed, but Commander Vextar still controlled critical systems that could destroy the entire station. "He's activated the self-destruct sequence," Alina reported grimly. We have less than an hour to evacuate everyone before this place becomes a nuclear fireball. Jake studied the evacuation routes and realized they needed more time. Can you disable the destruct system? Maybe, Alina replied. But I'd need to access the primary control room, and Vexter has barricaded himself in there with his personal guard. Korthak growled deep in his throat. Then we go through them. My warriors are ready for one final battle. Jake looked around at the faces of beings from dozens of worlds who had united under impossible circumstances. They had already achieved the impossible by organizing a successful rebellion. Now they needed to achieve one more miracle to survive. No, Jake said quietly. I have a better idea. Alina, you work on disabling the self-destruct. Korthok, you coordinate the evacuation. I'm going to have a conversation with our former commander. The battle for Kepler Station was entering its final phase. Captain Chen's rescue fleet was approaching fast, but time was running out. The legend of Jake Harrison was about to be written in the stars, but first he had to make sure his people survived to tell the story. Jake moved through the station corridors that had become battlefields as the uprising reached its climax. Freed prisoners fought desperately against Zephyrian security forces, while evacuation teams tried to reach the docking bays. The sound of weapon fire and shouting echoed from every direction. Alina worked frantically at a computer terminal trying to break through the command center's security locks. Her fingers flew over the controls as she used every trick she had learned during months of captivity. The self-destruct countdown showed 37 minutes remaining. I can't get through the main barriers, Alina reported over the communication. System Vexstar has isolated the control room from the rest of the network. Someone needs to physically access the primary console. Korthak's voice boomed through the chaos as he coordinated evacuation efforts. Transport ships are loading prisoners as fast as possible, but we need more time. Half the station population is still trapped in the lower levels. Jake studied the station blueprints that Alina had uploaded to his portable scanner. There was a maintenance shaft that led directly to the command center, but it would be heavily Commander Vexstar knew that his only hope was to destroy the station and everyone on it. Captain Lisa Chen's fleet emerged from hyperspace and immediately launched rescue shuttles toward Kepler Station. The sight of Terran Confederation ships sent waves of hope through the freed prisoners who had never expected to see home again. This is Captain Chen to all human personnel, Lisa broadcast on emergency frequencies. Confederation forces are standing by to assist. We're reading massive structural damage and recommend immediate evacuation. Jake made his way toward the command center through maintenance tunnels that Alina had mapped during her medical duties. The shafts were narrow and filled with pipes and cables, but they provided a route that avoided the main security checkpoints. Explosions rocked the station as Zephyrian reinforcements arrived from nearby systems. Commander Vexter's distress calls had brought additional warships that were now attacking the evacuation vessel. The rebellion was becoming a full-scale battle for survival. Alina finally broke through the outer security layers and began working on the self-destruct system itself. The program was more complex than she had expected, with multiple redundant safeguards. Every second counted as the countdown continued toward zero. I've found the primary shutdown sequence, Alina announced, but it requires command authorization codes that only Vexstar has access to. Korthok led a final assault against the guard positions, blocking the main evacuation routes. His warriors fought with the desperation of beings who had nothing left to lose. The massive Centaurian personally tore through barricades that had seemed impregnable. Jake reached the maintenance access point above the command center and carefully removed the ceiling panel. Below him, Commander Vexstar stood at the central control console surrounded by his elite guards. The Zephyrian commander was preparing for a final transmission to his superiors. Let the Empire know that I died, rather than allow valuable slaves. To escape, Vexstar spoke into his communicator. The humans have proven more dangerous than our analysts predicted. They must be hunted down and eliminated before they can inspire other species. Jake dropped through the ceiling opening and landed behind the guard formation. His sudden appearance caught the Zephyrians completely off guard. After months of arena combat, Jake's reflexes were razor sharp and his knowledge of alien physiology was extensive. The first guard went down before he could draw his weapon. Jake's sword found the gap between armor plates and struck vital organs. The second guard managed to fire one shot that went wide before Jake's counterattack silenced him permanently. Commander Vexstar spun around with his personal energy weapon raised. You should have died in the arena like a good slave, he snarled. Now you will watch your friends burn with the station. Jake circled the command console, keeping it between himself and Vexstar's weapon. Give me the shutdown codes and I'll make sure you survive this. Otherwise we all die together. Never Vexter hissed. The Empire does not negotiate with property. The two enemies faced each other across the control room while evacuation efforts continued throughout the station. 23 minutes remained. On the self-destruct countdown and thousands of lives hung in the balance, Elena's voice crackled through the communication system. Jake, I've isolated the command authorization sequence. If you can access the central console, I can walk you through the shutdown process. Vexstar fired his energy weapon, but Jake was already moving. The blast scorched the wall where he had been standing as he rolled behind a support pillar. The arena training had taught him to use every advantage the environment provided. Captain Chen's rescue shuttles were loading freed prisoners as fast as possible, but Zephyrian warships continued their attacks. The evacuation was becoming a running battle between opposing fleets while the station itself prepared to explode. Jake waited for Vexter to reload his weapon, then charged across the open space. His sword met the commander's energy blade in a shower of sparks. The Zephyrian was skilled, but Jake had fought dozens of opponents in the arena and learned from every encounter. You cannot win, human, Vexstar gasped as they battled around the control room. Even if you kill me, the destruct sequence cannot be stopped. My empire will hunt your species across the galaxy. Jake pressed his attack with renewed fury. The thought of Zephyrian slavers threatening Earth and other human worlds filled him with rage. This had to end here and now. The final exchange came when Vexter overextended his attack and left himself vulnerable. Jake's counterstrike found its mark and the Zephyrian commander collapsed beside his control console. With shaking hands, he reached for the destruct controls one final time. Jake reached the console first and began entering the shutdown sequence that Elena transmitted to him. Complex authorization codes scrolled across multiple displays as safety systems demanded confirmation. 15 minutes remained on the countdown. Almost there, Jake reported as he worked through the maze of security protocols. Elena, I need you to verify the final shutdown command. Throughout the station, evacuation ships continued loading rescued prisoners. Korthak's warriors maintained defensive positions, while technical teams disassembled critical systems to prevent the Zephyrians from regaining control. The countdown reached 5 minutes before Jake finally entered the last authorization code. The self-destruct sequence shut down with a series of warning tones and status displays returned to normal. Kepler Station would survive, but its days as a slave trading hub were over. Jake collapsed beside the console as the magnitude of what they had accomplished finally hit him. Thousands of beings from dozens of worlds had worked together to achieve the impossible. The human who was supposed to be a slave had become the leader of the greatest liberation in galactic history. 3 months after the liberation of Kepler Station, Jake Harrison stood on the bridge of the converted Cruiser Freedoms, Dawn watching as another group of rescued slaves prepared to return to their homeworlds. The ship had once belonged to slavers but now served as the flagship of the most unlikely fleet in galactic history. Captain Lisa Chen approached with the latest intelligence reports from across the sector. 17 more slave facilities have been abandoned in the past week, she informed Jake. The Zephyrians are pulling back from their outer territories. Jake studied the tactical displays that showed the rapidly changing balance of power. What had started as a single act of defiance on Kepler Station had sparked revolts across multiple star systems. The Zephyrian Empire was collapsing as slaves everywhere rose up against their captors. Any word from the Galactic Council? Jake asked, as he reviewed casualty reports from the latest liberation mission. They've agreed to an emergency session next month, Lisa replied. Apparently the idea of granting full membership status to Earth is no longer considered impossible. Jake smiled at the irony. For centuries humans had been ignored by the major galactic powers as a primitive species barely capable of interstellar travel. Now they were being courted as essential allies in the fight against slavery and oppression. Dr. Elena Rodriguez joined them carrying data tablets filled with research on rehabilitation programs for former slaves. Her work helping traumatized prisoners recover from their experiences had become as legendary as Jake's arena victories. The psychological healing will take years for most survivors, Elena reported, but having their freedom gives them hope for the first time since capture. That's the most important medicine we can provide. Korthak's booming laughter echoed from the ship's main cargo bay where he was training new recruits from recently liberated worlds. The massive Centaurian had become the military commander of their growing fleet, and his reputation for fierce loyalty inspired beings across dozens of species. My friend Korthak called as he spotted Jake in the corridor. The new warriors. We show great promise. Your example has taught them that courage is more powerful than weapons or armor. Jake appreciated the compliment but still felt uncomfortable with the hero worship that had grown around his story. He had simply refused to accept slavery and done what needed to be done. The real heroes were the thousands of beings who had risked everything to fight for freedom. The communication officer announced an incoming transmission from the Andromedian homeworld. President Zekalon appeared on the main screen with news that would reshape the political landscape of the galaxy. Commander Harrison, the four-armed leader, began formally. The Andromedian Republic wishes to join your Liberation Alliance. We can provide ships, weapons, and personnel for operations against remaining Zephyrian strongholds. Similar offers had arrived from worlds across the sector as governments realized that the liberation movement was more than just a slave revolt. It had become a moral crusade that was changing how entire civilizations viewed freedom and justice. Jake accepted the alliance offer knowing that each new member brought them closer to ending the slave trade permanently. But he also worried about the growing expectations that people had for him personally. The legend was becoming larger than the man. Alina approached him during the evening shift change with concerns about their next mission. Intelligence reports indicate that the Zephyrians are consolidating their remaining operations around their homeworld. If we attack there, it won't be a liberation, it will be a war. Jake had been wrestling with the same problem. How far should they push their campaign against the slave traders? At what point did liberation become conquest, and heroes become conquerors? We'll continue rescuing prisoners wherever we find them, Jake decided, but we won't attack civilian targets or invade Zephyrian space just for revenge. This movement has to stay true to its principles. Korthak nodded approvingly. My clan's ancient wisdom teaches that justice and vengeance are different paths. We must choose carefully which one we follow. News of Jake's decision spread quickly, through the Liberation Fleet and beyond. Former slaves throughout the galaxy saw that their leader remained committed to freedom rather than domination. The movement's moral authority was strengthened rather than compromised. Captain Chen received authorization from Earth Command to expand the joint operations between Confederation forces and the Liberation Fleet. Humanity's rapid rise to galactic prominence was largely due to Jake's actions, but the entire species was benefiting from changed perceptions. The Council has agreed to fast-track Earth's membership application, Chen reported. They want human representatives at the table when they redraw territorial boundaries and establish new trade agreements. Jake realized that his personal story had become intertwined with humanity's future among the stars. The engineer who had simply wanted to return home had accidentally changed the course of galactic civilization. 6 months later, Jake addressed a gathering of representatives from 47 liberated worlds. The assembly had grown from desperate slaves planning escape to legitimate governments, rebuilding their societies. The transformation was remarkable. When I was captured, I thought only about survival, Jake told the assembled delegates. I never imagined that refusing to accept injustice could lead to something like this. But that's the power of the human spirit, and it exists in all of us, regardless of species. The crowd included beings who had been slaves just months earlier, but now served as ambassadors and leaders. Children from multiple worlds played together in the assembly hall while their parents planned a future built on cooperation instead of conquest. Alina had established medical colleges that taught rehabilitation techniques to healers from dozens of worlds. Her research on trauma recovery was helping millions of former slaves rebuild their lives with dignity and purpose. Korthok commanded a military alliance that protected trade routes and responded to distress calls throughout the sector. His warriors came from species that had been enemies for centuries, but learned to fight together for common principles. The Zephyrian Empire still existed but was greatly diminished. Most of their slave operations had been shut down and their military forces were stretched thin defending their core territories. The threat they posed was manageable rather than overwhelming. Jake concluded his address by looking toward the future. Rather than dwelling on past victories, the real test of our movement will come in the years ahead. We must prove that beings from different worlds can build something better together than any of us could achieve alone. Later that evening, Jake stood alone on the observation deck, watching stars that now represented free worlds instead of slave markets. His reflection in the viewport showed a man who had been changed by extraordinary circumstances but remained committed to ordinary human values. Alina joined him, as she often did during quiet moments. Do you ever regret that your engineering job turned into this? Jake considered the question seriously. I miss the simplicity of fixing engines and solving technical problems. But I wouldn't change anything if it meant those people were still in chains. Children's laughter echoed from the ship's recreation areas. where young beings from a dozen species played games that would have been impossible before the liberation. Their parents had been slaves, but these children would grow up free. The legend of Jake Harrison continued growing with each retelling, but the man himself remained focused on the future. Somewhere in the galaxy there might still be beings in chains waiting for someone to refuse acceptance of injustice. As long as that possibility existed, the fight would continue. The human who was supposed to be a slave had become something greater than a legend. He had become a symbol that freedom was worth any sacrifice and that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they refused to give up hope.